Thank you very much, Sebastian, for that and for inviting me here, Hans-Jörg and everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to be here because when I see the program, there are so many names whose work I have been following and appreciating over the years that it's actually wonderful to now be able to meet and interact with all of you. So thank you very much. Now, all I have to do is find my presentation, which is... okay, got it. Yeah. Yes, thank you.
Okay. There's nothing you should care about.
Not this. Can we get the full screen?
Yeah, for sure.
Great. Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, yes. Lovely. Yeah. Great. Yeah. That's fine. Seems to be working. Yes. Oh, yes. Well, I'm not actually going to talk very much about the history of globalization, perhaps only tangentially. What I want to do is look really at this century and globalization today in relation to past globalization, because capitalism has always been a global project, really. And we know that globalization today, global capitalism today, is largely stagnant and generally unstable. That's not news to anyone here. I'm just putting this out there to remind us that it's been what everyone calls a new normal, secular stagnation, etc., is actually a period of capitalism limping along in relative terms. The blue columns are the absolute changes in growth, in GDP, and the red line is the rate of growth. And as you can see, it's relatively stagnant and unstable. But the point that is more important to make here is, I'm going to talk a lot about the development project, is that decoupling is a myth. This whole discussion that, developing countries have somehow created a separate growth pole that was very common before the global crisis, and it really refers to just this 5-year period, 2002 to 2007, when there was a relative stagnation in the growth of the advanced economies and an increase in the emerging market and developing economies. But as the global crisis brought home, we are still strongly dependent and linked, and subsequent behavior also has pretty much confirmed this. There's no decoupling. It's very, very heavily dependent. Now, that doesn't mean that there will be no decoupling in future, but it really means we're all in that same sinking boat, if you like. However, in that period, developing countries did increase their share of global GDP quite significantly, as you can see, going up, especially in that period of the 2000s that I mentioned, almost doubling in a decade, and then stagnating. Then it's been relatively stagnant. But in fact, even since 2009, developing countries alone have contributed about 2/3 of global growth, as you can see. About 43% in the period pre-crisis and about 65% in the period post-crisis. So, in fact, developing countries are becoming, in that sense, more and more responsible for any growth that does occur in global capitalism. However, even that is very, very region-specific. And if you look at this recent period, the period after the global crisis, it's really China and the United States that are responsible for global growth. China contributing 36% of global growth in this period. It's all GDP growth. We all know that GDP is a terrible indicator. We all know it's a mess, etc. But hey, global capitalism is all about GDP. So let's just, recognize that and say in its own terms, China is the big contributor to GDP over here, more than 1/3. The United States with 26%, just above a quarter. Most other countries, regions, relatively around the same. The ASEAN 5 has increased to 5%, but it's still relatively small. Please notice that Europe's net impact is negative. Germany contributes 1.2%, but then the Eurozone without Germany, there's a decline of 3.4%. Other Europe, only 2.1%, so the net is actually negative in terms of just GDP growth. In fact, the impulse coming out of Europe for the rest of the global economy in general is negative because that GDP growth, as we will see later, is also accompanied by current account surpluses. So it's a negative in terms of global capitalism. It's playing a sort of depressing role. So then the question is, all right, it's unstable and so on, but maybe that's actually good for the development project. There have been arguments for and against this, okay? If you like, the people who argue that global stability is good for development. They say, well, look, when you have a stable global economy, then you have what Kindleberger called, the global leader, who fulfills all these important functions of discounting in a crisis for individual countries, counter-cyclical credit when markets don't deliver the credit, and a market for distress exports, without which imbalances don't get resolved. And all of that stability then enables the expansion of trade and investment within and across nations. And that provides a secure environment for investment. You need that kind of predictability for enhanced investment. All of that economic growth then gives you more stability and peace. This is the argument. And this in turn enables you to reap the advantages of the division of labor, because ultimately trade is supposed to just give you all of those advantages of division of labor, specialization, and so on. That's one set of arguments. There's another lot that says, well, no. Actually, in fact, the absence of a clear leader is sometimes good, because clear global leadership actually sets the rules according to the wishes of the global leader. And that in turn, and the framework that they can create, the international architecture that they can create, can actually lock countries and economies into their existing positions. Whereas the absence of that leader and the breaking up of all the earlier trade ties allows economies often to expand in their own ways through new patterns of production and trade. This is especially important because the international division of labor can be a very restrictive thing for countries that are trying to raise their position in that ladder. Essentially because of static and dynamic economies of scale, it's well known that if you don't have a large presence of increasing returns industries, you're less likely to have them. So both the synergies involved in industrialization and the ability to break out of a particular pattern of labor, all of that is more difficult when everything is kind of already rigid and laid down. There is also the argument that stability itself is the result of uneven development, is the result of, if you like, depressing some countries at the expense of others. The periods of global stability, the famous golden age post-war and so on, were periods when, in fact, the costs of adjustment were passed on to developing countries. Whether you're talking about the gold standard period or the Bretton Woods golden age and so on, costs of adjustment essentially passed on asymmetrically to developing countries. So that, in a sense, perpetuates that lack of development. And it's true that, past phases of late industrialization occur, widespread late industrialization, not just a few, occur really during periods of global instability. The 1930s is a period of significant industrialization in India, in Latin America, in Egypt, in a range of countries. The 70s, 80s, it's the period of East Asian industrialization. And these are really periods that everybody else thinks of as, unstable and unhappy periods for the global economy. So, if that's the case, will global instability today help development? Is it something that we should say, well, fine, all of you guys in Europe and so on can suffer, but we are doing all right. We will grow. It depends. And there are two reasons why it's probably different. First of all, of course, is the whole issue of trade. Now, a breakdown in trade relations helps economies that are not heavily reliant on global demand. So it would really require a change in the accumulation strategy. In an export-led model, lack of demand is a critical constraint, and that is, of course, what developing countries across the world are facing today, because all of them have adopted this export-led, or I would say export-obsessed model. In fact, you have exported your obsession from Germany to the rest of the world. We all want net export growth, okay? And the other big difference is international financial integration. Basically, it is the fact that there's a volatile situation in terms of cross-border flows, which generates, as we all know, massive internal instability. That in turn means that none of us anymore has an independent monetary policy. Whether or not we join a monetary union, we are all now forced to look at global interest rates, global patterns of capital flow to determine our own monetary policy. We lose the possibilities, therefore, also of directing credit, which was absolutely essential for all industrialization through history. There are obvious constraints on fiscal policy, especially increasing public expenditure. But the most important point is that domestic savings is no longer available to finance domestic investment. And that's absolutely critical. There is this break of the link. So even if you have a high domestic savings rate, it may not be invested in your own country, even though your development project is very far away from being complete. So if you like, the uphill movement of capital, the net flow of financial resources from south to north, which has been a feature of the global boom, is also a feature of the global bust. So, as I mentioned, the problem of global demand, I mean, all this instability, stagnation, etc., ultimately, what is it? It's insufficient demand globally. And it's very clear now that the developed countries no more provide a net demand stimulus. They run current account surpluses in Europe, for example, or smaller deficits, such as the US. And if you look at it, it's really the developing countries that are now providing some deficits. These are the developing countries, not including the newly industrializing economies, which really should be seen as developed countries already. Convergence, this is the point Hans-Jörg made. Convergence is very, very limited. It's not true that it hasn't occurred at all, but it's actually only the East Asian newly industrializing economies that have succeeded even partially in closing the absolute income gap. So over here, this is the first-tier NICs, that is Taiwan, China, Malaysia, Singapore, and Hong Kong. And there you have per capita incomes achieving the US. This is in PPP rates, which is a problem, but nonetheless, approaching that about 80% of the US by 2015. China, which everyone sees as the great new global power, still at only 30% of US per capita in PPP terms. In market exchange rates, it's only about 10%. And I think that's very important to bear in mind. It's still nowhere near anything like approaching a developed country per capita. And Southeast Asia, everyone talks about Malaysia and so on, still, really well below on average. And the rest of the world, as you can see, well, South Asia too. Everyone talks about the great Indian growth miracle, but look, we are still at 15% in PPP terms. That's like 6% in market exchange rates. And look at the rest of the world, even in PPP terms, Sub-Saharan Africa has actually fallen, Latin America fallen slightly, North Africa approximately the same, despite benefiting from the oil boom. There's also the point, I've missed a slide here. Anyway, never mind. There was a slide, I thought I had a slide which actually showed that the only period of global convergence was before the globalization period. In other words, 50 to 80 showed much stronger convergence than the 90s, 2000s. So the period of globalization has actually been a period of less convergence than the previous period when trade was less open and capital flows were more restricted. But you have to take my word for it, but I do have the data. Okay, so why not? Why not more convergence? I think Hans-Jörg already mentioned some of those reasons. One of them is the fact that there's an increasing concentration of both global production and distribution, and this is expressed in global value chains. I'll come back to that. The other reason is, in fact, increasing internal economic inequality, even in the countries that have converged, even in China, for example. There's much more substantial internal economic inequality. But the global value chains and the race to the bottom in particular stages of production and assembly, I would argue, is a very, very important reason. I just want to mention here that in these global value chains, it's often a further disaggregation of the labor force. If you do into male and female, you will find women disproportionately badly affected. one of the reasons why these global value chains concentrate income in the pre- and post-production phases is because of intellectual property rights. They create monopolies in the high-profit phases, pre-production, design, and so on, post-production, branding, marketing, and so on. And that's really where all the profits get concentrated, and the incomes in the production stage get actually reduced because we're all competing against each other to become the location. In addition to that, something you are all familiar with in Europe, macroeconomic policies that reduce demand, fiscal austerity, and so on, or at best, they generate growth based on unsustainable credit bubbles. And this is related to the other aspects of inequality, the lack of willingness or ability to tax the rich, and the fact that employment creation is really not the focus of economic policy. It's always GDP growth, however defined. This is the smiley curve that's often talked about. For the multinationals that are in the value chain, it's a smiley curve because they're making all their profits in management, finance, design, R&D, and in marketing, branding, advertising, and sales. All the profits are concentrated here. The work is done in the south, in the production, but the value added in the production is very, very low. Okay, smiley for one set of people and the opposite for the vast majority. But in addition, in the developing world, finance still makes economies very vulnerable. Now, just one proxy indicator is US cross-border financial flows, and as you can see, extremely volatile still. And that volatility, of course, it increased hugely during the global crisis, but it has remained kind of quite high, right? This volatility. And critically, developing countries which were net recipients of capital flows for a while have been actually not receiving capital flows, net inflows now for about 2.5 years. So when we say that developing countries have recovered, it's really a debt-based recovery. And this is true across the board. Whichever developing region you want to look at, you will find that it's true. It's a recovery based on debt. This is the ratio of debt service to income of the private sector as a proxy for the aggregate debt. And as you can see, in developed countries, it's coming down very strongly, just as it is rising hugely for developing countries. But it is also true in all the success stories of today and in every developing region. And of course, this impact of financialization has a much larger significance. I know all of you know all this. Certainly for the developed world, you know this, for Europe and so on. But it's very strongly evident also in developing countries. You get financial deepening, but that deepening does not have a positive effect on investment or real economic growth. Instead, what it generates are savings, so-called surpluses, which are really not surpluses. They're because investment has collapsed. What Ben Bernanke called a savings glut famously some years ago was not a savings glut. It was an investment famine. It was a complete collapse of investment. And that's what generated these surpluses that were then exported. And obviously, if your development project is incomplete and you collapse your investment, then productive diversification is retarded. And the economy then has these boom and bust cycles, depending on whether you get capital inflow and then an asset bubble and so on. So insofar as we have domestic growth, it is sustained by consumer credit that fuels housing and real estate booms and finance for related investment. I don't have to tell you that these bubbles end in tears, not in Germany, of course, but certainly you know about this in the Eurozone periphery. And as the unraveling of household and corporate debt has knock-on adverse effects on bank viability, it in turn affects investment. Now, in the developing world, all of this is happening in the context of a global trade slowdown, which obviously adds to the existing pressures. I want to just give you two examples of, again, countries that are seen as success stories. This is Malaysia, and you can see how the East Asian financial crisis had this terrific impact on opening up the financial sector and creating that imbalance. The Malaysian savings rate, this red line, going up nicely, very, very high, to about 48%, and then stays high, but falls to about 35%. But look what happens to investment, the blue line. It goes up along with savings, and it's a high rate of investment generating high rates of growth. Investment collapses and stays low. And it's that difference which is the so-called savings glut. That's the thing which generates that export of savings from Malaysia, essentially to the US, largely to the developed world. You can see how the investment rate has really had nothing to do with the typical financial indicators, domestic credit to the private sector or stock market capitalization. And this is something which you find across Asian economies, that the financialization generates stock market bubbles, it generates, expansion of credit, but it doesn't necessarily generate real investment and growth. Something similar happening in Indonesia, this gap over here, and it's only very recently that they have come together with the new government that actually tried to bring back the investment rate. And similarly, no relationship between investment and all of these stock market capitalization and credit ratios. Okay, now one question that is often asked is, okay, fine, that's all of the rest of you, but what really matters is China. And it's true, China is the elephant in everybody's room, right? It's the largest trading partner for almost every economy in the world, certainly every region, and it is hugely significant in world trade and increasingly in global investment. So maybe China can take up the slack. And it's true at one level. Here's the US in terms of share of exports, here's China in terms of share of exports, and you can see how in the post-global crisis period, China is now more than 12% of global exports, significantly more than the US. This is just India for comparison to remind you that you really should not be talking about India in the same breath at all. Okay? Similarly, even in terms of imports, which is also very, very significant, Chinese imports from the rest of the world have increased dramatically, and they are mostly of raw material and intermediates, which have therefore meant increasing demand for developing countries dominantly. And so while the US share of imports has come down, that of China has gone up. So yes, there is a sense in which China could perhaps take up the slack. And of course, we all know that the Chinese growth miracle is quite astounding. GDP increases by 3 times over this three-decade period, 3.5-decade period, 33 times, sorry, what am I saying, yes. And this growth is not a surprise, really, if you look at the investment rates. These are unbelievable investment rates of between 35 to, in some years, even 48%, okay? To have sustained high investment rates of this proportion is very, very unusual. And China's expansion has really been driven by this very, very high investment rate. But recently, like many other developing countries, its recovery and growth has been based on debt. Every single sector, whether it's governments, corporations, households, has dramatically increased its debt, doubled its debt. Debt ratios across the country now very, very high, to the point where the additional credit required for every unit of GDP has tripled. It's gone from around 1 to around 3 in the post-crisis period. Rebalancing is underway, investment rates are coming down, and so on, but it's a partial rebalancing. It's much more, the internal rebalancing is occurring. The external rebalancing also happened quite significantly in the beginning, just after the crisis, but it is now once again, the current account surplus is rising once again. And that's essentially because Chinese imports have fallen more than its exports. So really, the current account surplus is rising because China is importing less, not because it's stopped exporting quite as much. It is exporting less, sure, as you can see, but it is certainly importing even less. Now, and this is particularly true of the imports with the developing world. That's what matters for the rest of us. So the flying geese model, where China would drive the rest of us along, is less evident. Now, what does this mean? It means that China is rebalancing, but that's not actually good news for the rest of the developing world. Because, in fact, it's another source of less demand for those economies that have been now so heavily dependent on exports. If you want a sustained recovery, you require a Chinese version of a Marshall Plan. Now, the point about the Marshall Plan, though, if you remember, is that it was characterized by a number of things. It was speed, scale, generosity. It was very rapid. It was very large relative to a small number of economies in Western Europe. And it was very generous, mostly in grants and very low-interest loans. All of this was crucial in reviving global demand in the mid-20th century. And that recovery was accompanied by redistribution and regulation. In other words, welfare state practices and redistributive practices. China's One Belt, One Road has some echoes of the Marshall Plan, as you can see, but it's geographically much more widespread. It's huge. I mean, the kinds of infrastructure planned all over the place are enormous. It's much more long-term. It's envisaged to stretch over 30 years. And it is much less generous because, in fact, the actual outlays so far, I mean, the expectation is 1 trillion. The actual outlays are not more than 3-4 billion at the moment. And it's much more in terms of co-financing with domestic partners. So will it do the trick? I don't think so. There are these 6 cooperation corridors. It's both basically infrastructure-based. It is global Keynesianism to a point, because the idea is to provide a market for the current overcapacity in China in basic and infrastructure industries. But as I mentioned, the financing is really still not all that clear. The AIIB, the NDB, the Silk Road Fund, all together, the total funds come to only about 240 billion, and only a part of that is actually going to be devoted to this project. But what is more worrying is that if you look at the document, the OBOR initiative is a very neoliberal one. It's all about financial integration, protection of private investors, investment facilitation. It's doing everything that the WTO and all the other trade agreements want to do as well. So how do you revive this is my last slide, Sebastian, I promise.
I'm fine.
How do you actually revive the development project then? Well, you can't really just sit back and hope that China will do it for you. You actually have to use the opportunity to move away from that model, the export-obsessed model, to focus on wage and employment-led growth. Investment push is critical. It usually requires active state intervention. The point is that manufacturing still matters, but you obviously have to factor in ecological considerations. And you have to look at small producers in agriculture, out of agriculture. Obviously, that requires addressing income and asset inequality through direct taxation, but particularly that element of the regulation of both capital and labor markets. That's absolutely critical. Can't do that without regulating financial markets. Social policy as a development policy. This is really how the Nordic countries did it. That you expand social spending, which creates multiplier effects and creates that kind of bubbling up that was talked about. But of course, all of this requires international cooperation. We don't think that's coming anytime immediately, right? That doesn't look like the kind of picture that we get. The cooperation happens to be today between the Saudis and the US administration, rather than the kind of global international cooperation that we were hoping for. So if that's not coming, what do we hope for? We hope, okay, just leave us alone. In other words, less external pressure from global rules and global institutions. If, in fact, those global rules and global institutions play less of a role in constraining the development project, then all that global instability might still ultimately be a good thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much.